Awesome. Nā mai, haere mai, everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the conversation on the threat of seabed mining in the Pacific and international waters. Today, as we call on the New Zealand and other governments to support a deep sea mining moratorium in international waters, we want to start by showing you the incredible life that is in our deep sea. For a lot of us, it is a faraway issue, and it is hard for us to picture the fragility and the wonderful life forms that are there. We hope the short video will help you see the realness of this wonderful world and the need to protect it. All right, we'd like to thank DSCC for sharing that wonderful video with us. We will also be sharing another video that will help you understand the true cost of deep sea mining, and I will share the link to that in the chat box. And I now will hand over to James to welcome and do a mihi.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ki te matua te tamata wairua tapu me ngā anihira pono me te māngai hei tautoko mai ai nei ake nei ai. Ko he mihita tōku ingoa. He kai hāpai porotehi huke papa moana taku tūranga mahi mo Greenpeace Aotearoa. I understand that many of our whānau or family here today, our guests, you, won't be able to fully understand what's being said in Te Reo Māori. So I just want to quickly go through a translation of the opening I've just given here. And as we go on, I'll share what some of the kōrero or conversations we're having mean in Te Reo Pākehā or English. So I've just opened our hui here with a Rātana prayer, which is the faith that I follow. This simply acknowledges the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the faithful angels, and the mouthpiece of God. I also introduced myself to you. So my name is James Hita, and I'm the seabed mining campaigner for Greenpeace Aotearoa. It's always an honour to share the knowledge that we need to stand together united against this destruction that the seabed mining and deep sea mining industries will bring. I'll now go through the process of, it's a traditional Māori process of mihi, which is a welcoming for our guests, our honoured guests here today. And this will also open the space for us to share in a very important kōrero conversation. Tūhia ki te rangi, tūhia ki te whenua, tūhia ki te ngākau o ngā tangata, ko te mea nui ko te aroha, te hei mauri ora. Write it in the sky, write it in the land, write it in the heart of the people. The greatest thing is love. Behold, there is life. Kia tau mai te aroha ngā manaakitanga o te atua. Descend on us the love, the care of the Creator. I ngā manuhiri o ngā hauewha, i ngā waka o ngā taiewha, e te iwi o te moana nui ākiwa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. To the visitors of the four winds, the canoes of the four shores, to the people of the Pacific, greetings, greetings, greetings to you all. Tēnā koutou I o tātou tini mate, koutou kua wheturangitia, ki te korowai o rangi nui. Koutou kua wehe atu ki te pō, ki te tua o te arai ki te oki-okinga. I o tātou tupuna, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Greetings to those who have passed on, you who have been adorned as stars in the heavens, you who have departed to the night, to beyond, to the resting place of our ancestors, farewell, farewell, farewell. Te hunga mate ki te hunga mate, te hunga ora ki te hunga ora, the past over connected to the past over, the living connected to the living. I ngā manuhiri, no mai, haere mai. Haere mai I raro I te korowai o te rangi Māori e. To our visitors, welcome, welcome under the cloak of peace. Tēnā koutou kia koutou, kua tai mai nei ki te awhi I a mātou I tēnei wā. Greetings to you who've come here to support us at this time. E hara hau I te tangata mōhio ki te kōrero I te reo Māori, o tira e tika ana kia mihi atu, kia mihi mai. I am not all-knowing at speaking te reo Māori, but it is right that we exchange greetings. No te raudo, nā ku te raudo, ka ki te kete. With your basket of knowledge and my basket of knowledge, the kete will be full. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Therefore, greetings to you all. Ki te matua te tama te wairua tapu me ngā ane hiro pono me te māngai, hei tautoko mai, ai nei, āki nei, ai. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora tātou. Thanks, James, and thanks, Aisha, for the video and James' introduction, and welcome. I'm Barry Weaver. I'm the co-chair of the Environment and Conservation Organisations. ECO is a coalition of groups with a concern for the environment based in New Zealand. And with us, we've got our two other partner organisations brought this together, the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, which is a coalition of groups working on both deep sea mining, but also working on the impacts of fishing on vulnerable marine ecosystems and features. For ECO, this is its 50th year, so we've been around 50 years. I think Greenpeace as well. Our third partner has been, it's 50 years since Greenpeace was formed globally, so it's quite an auspicious time for both organisations and for deep sea conservation generally. ECO as well, I should say, is a member of the IUCN and also as a member of Deep Sea Conservation Coalition as part of our work in globally outside of New Zealand. So thanks everyone, and with that I will, with that introduction to the three groups who have organised this webinar, and we'll probably hear more from the speakers as well about the organisations. I'll pass on to Phil McCabe from Deep Sea Conservation Coalition to work us through the next speaker. Thanks, Phil. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā tātou katoa, and thank you, Barry. Thank you, James, also for the grounding of that beautiful mihi. Welcome everyone. My name is Phil McCabe. I'm the Pacific Regional Lead on Deep Sea Mining for the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. And I'll be the moderator of today's discussion. So just acknowledging the panelists for taking time out of their lives to join us today, and welcome to all the participants for dialing in for this discussion. The format, we've got four panelists who will each provide a prepared statement, and then we'll move to question and answer, and there'll be plenty of time for question and answer and discussion and dialogue between panelists and participants. So you can, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A, and we'll move to those, and then we'll wind things up by 2 p.m. So just to frame today's discussion, this is a discussion about deep sea mining, a proposed activity that is not underway anywhere in the world at this point in time, but is fast moving towards being enabled. Just under a year ago, when Nauru triggered the 2-year rule, which effectively set the timer for the International Seabed Authority, a UN-affiliated organisation, a UN-mandated organisation based in Jamaica that has authority over roughly half of the planet, the seabed of international waters. When Nauru triggered that 2-year rule, it effectively set the timer for the International Seabed Authority to either complete the formation of the rules and regulations that then allow for countries and companies to apply for mining, or issue a license to Nauru and their partner company, Deep Green, or now known as the Metals Company. It kind of, 1 year ago, it kind of really woke the world up. It shook the world, and they kind of poked the bear. And what we've seen since then is much more engagement from states, much more attention on this issue from civil society and communities across the region and the globe. And I think as those of us that are working really intensely in the middle of this campaign, global campaign, I think as it evolves, and we're getting closer to the point of the ISA enabling the activity by issuing a license, we're starting to see a sort of shift in perception around how parties, stakeholders, countries engage with the issue. And I think there's a distinction emerging between the technical discussion that's going on in the chambers of the ISA, and there's a separate political discussion that's emerging quite like in real time right now. And that's a discussion around the call, or the need to call for wise, responsible action from a higher viewpoint than within the technical bounds of the ISA. So with that, I'm really pleased that we can have this first discussion. I hope we can have another level of discussion going forward in the coming weeks or months. But it's wonderful to have the panelists on board and participants here to listen in and engage. We welcome your participation when we move to question and answers. And I'll move to our first panelist, and that is Joey Tao from the Pacific Blue Line and Pacific Network on Globalization. Joey's is based in Fiji, and engaged in this issue deeply. And the Pacific Blue Line is a collective. It's a regional organization, a collective of organizations that reach into society across the region, and they are calling for a ban. And Joey's in the center of that discussion and engaging with all parts of society. So Joey, thank you for joining us and welcome. You have the floor.
A big Bulavinaka, and just want to thank Phil and the organizers for putting this important webinar together. And it's very fitting as the global community prepares to commemorate World Oceans Day on the 8th of June, and state parties or the global community also preparing for the second World UN Oceans Conference set in Lisbon later this month. Very honored to speak on behalf of the Pacific Blue Line Collective, but also PANG and its extended partners. Just wanted to share with you the experiences that civil society in the Pacific that have been working on this issue on deep sea mining over the past 10 years or so. I was asked to provide a background of deep sea mining in the Pacific and civil society movements, indigenous groups movements in the Pacific that have been resisting this form of exploitation. But I thought it was also fitting to just also give a rundown on how the formal structures had happened and what really triggered deep sea mining. And some of its earliest works in the Pacific have taken place as early as 2008, 2009. Pacific states were looking into the option of deep sea minerals. And in August 2010, the Regional Deep Sea Mining Project under then the Secretary of the Pacific Community, had commenced an official agreement with the European Union, and that was in 2010. The SPC EU project had just been formalized then, and that project was looking to assisting Pacific territories and states back then to form a regional understanding on deep sea mining. It was to assist Pacific states to form policies and legislations on DSM, and also to very much help national states or Pacific states form a national position on deep sea mining. Just a year later, in 2011, Papua New Guinea granted the world's first deep sea mining commercial license to Nautilus Minerals, a Canadian company that was formally registered with the Toronto Stock Exchange, and it was awarded the Solwara 1 project in the Bismarck waters of Papua New Guinea. Again, to note, very important, this was issued or rather permitted in absence of proper legislation, proper policies to really administer such an experimental project. And PNG back then had issued these permits based on a Terrestrial Mining Act, which governed most of its mining activities on land. And fast forward 2012, this was really an important moment in the history of deep sea mining in the Pacific. And it was at the Pacific Island Leaders Forum I remember in the Cook Islands in 2012, that the SPC and the European Union deep sea mining had launched a regional and regulatory framework for deep sea mining exploration and exploitation in the Pacific. This is an important point to take note of because it kind of formally triggered the process of deep sea mining where states needed to, or at some point needed to adopt national policies and legislations where you see now you have, in the instance of Nauru, you have the Nauru Seabed Mining Act, where countries at that time were adopting this regional framework, again, supported by the European Union. An important thing to note is that this policy framework really failed to feature some of the important components of this process where we've been calling for free, prior, informed consent, the need for proper national procedures, consulting with national key stakeholders, indigenous groups, community groups, women's groups. This legal framework lacked environmental, or rather the need for environmental impact studies. It failed to protect the sovereign rights of Pacific state. Somewhat it was facilitating the interest of industry. I had no consideration for transboundary harm, an issue that is still heavily debated in the International Seabed Authority, and the lack to apply precautionary principles in absence of any policy or framework. Also at this time, between 2010 and 2014, DSM was then really strongly proposed by industry players, and again, development partners as a better economic alternative or an economic adventure for Pacific states and small island developing states. Again, it was proposed as a project with no impacts to large profit returns. And we needed to note that at that time there was no such, and even today, there was no such activity at this extent that took place anywhere. There were just explorations done in international waters, again, rather in national waters. There were also exploration licenses being issued with no legislations in the case of Papua New Guinea. So there was really nothing to really safeguard or protect. And from that time on, we could really learn, and in our line of campaign, we normally have to draw from the experiences of Papua New Guinea, who issued the first license. And when they did in 2012, there was this big resistance from community groups, coastal marine communities, even national groups such as, and I'd like to just acknowledge ACNOW PNG, Bismarck Ramu, who were very much the foundation key players in Papua New Guinea who had collaborated with regional NGOs such as the Pacific Conference of Churches, Piango and Pang, to name a few. And we really highlighted it again, drawing from PNG's experiences. There was lack of proper consultation, yet exploration was taking place in front of the waterfronts of these communities in the Bismarck Sea in Papua New Guinea. And people were starting to see the impacts on their fishing activities and their cultural practices in the case of the shark calling group of the Nusa Islands. And then there was this big call for a moratorium back in 2014 in Papua New Guinea. And from that position, civil societies, community groups had mobilized and had protested against Nautilus. At that time, Nautilus had contracts with countries like Tonga, the Kingdom of Tonga, Vanuatu, Fiji, Nauru, to name a few. Fast forward to 2019, Nautilus, the Canadian company that had a lot of exploration licenses or rather permits in the Pacific, was facing stiff opposition to the campaigns and the resistance from community groups. And I would attribute that to the power of people power, who had mobilized and really campaigned strongly against Nautilus. That affected lack of investor interest. And from that time on, Nautilus was facing this problem of lack of investors. Come 2019, it faced bankruptcy, which costed the Papua New Guinean government. And again, we can learn from the PNG experience. Moving on from there, learning from Papua New Guinea in working with other national partners throughout the Pacific, Vanuatu had really called for a national consultation just to ensure that national processes were met. People were consulted, chiefs, you name, villages, members of parliament. There was this need for stronger consultation to really understand the impacts, what is at stake, and how this venture would go ahead. So we have moved on from there. Pacific groups have mobilized, namely the churches, working with parliamentary leaders, chiefs, traditional leaders, women's groups, youths and NGOs are really challenging this process that as governments and states and development partners venture into this new model as they term development, it is important to consult the wider FAR communities here in the Pacific. For us here in the Pacific, the ocean remains an important part of us. And as Phil had mentioned, as the international community is working the technical engine of this development framework, for Pacific people, it's us calling for the moral high ground to take an ethical approach, because the Pacific informs who we are as a group of peoples and our lives depend heavily on it. I think I'll end there and I'll leave it open for questions and answers at the end. Vinaka.
Vinaka, Joey, thank you. Thank you so much for that background and sharing the historical context within that's led to where we find ourselves at this point in time. Thank you. I'd next like to invite Pelena Tita or Tita Kara from Tonga. Tita is the Deep Sea Mining National Campaign Manager for the Civil Society Forum of Tonga, which is an umbrella organisation of NGOs and community groups across the 5 island groups of Tonga. Tita's been long involved with the deep sea mining issue. She participated in the SPC EU deep sea mining program, that project that Joey just talked about. And Tita's been consulting in an ongoing way with communities across Tonga. And I'll just mention also that Tonga is a sponsoring state at the ISA for the company now known as the Metals Company, and under a subsidiary of the Metals Company who's partnered with the Tongan government. Tita, welcome. Thank you for your time, and you have the floor.
Aloha Lei from Tonga, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to acknowledge the previous speaker. Joey has provided the backdrop that will lead quite nicely into my component, which is basically looking at the Tonga as a sponsoring state and the fact that it's not equipped and not ready for a long shot to be able to negotiate being a sponsoring partner and dealing with the likes of Deep Green, now called the metal company. In 2020, we did a whole across the island Zoom about deep sea mining. And the unanimous comeback from across our 144 communities, groups, as well as 38 CSO, they are saying no to deep sea mining. They have the unanimous call to ban deep sea mining within Tonga EEZ as well as the area or the ocean beyond our national jurisdiction. Feel the whole angst that we have against deep sea mining is that Tonga as a sponsoring state is not ready, nor will be for a long time because we don't know the science. But I think ours stems from the fact that we care about the livelihood of our people. We know that Tonga does not have the expertise, nor the cash, nor the technical know-how to actually manage any case of deep sea mining. These companies have the resources at their discretion. They have the expertise and they have the reach and the packing that, you know, one small country like Tonga does not have. The legislation that Joey made reference to earlier were constructed, written in a time that, you know, we barely know nothing about deep sea mining. You know, how can a toddler run when it hasn't crawled? So that kind of like perspective. The legal framework that we have is not robust enough, as Joey has mentioned before. You know, if we proceed with the whole mining thing, we don't have any packing to actually assess the EIA. These will be done by the company, and Tonga will not be able or not in a position to actually assess any EIA. So we from a civil society are very mindful that the liabilities that will come as part of the state responsibility will fall on the rest of the community to pay. If there are any issue with the mining, Joey made reference to transporters pollution. You know, those are issues we never thought about before. If it's happening now, you know, we don't have the finance to actually manage that. So these are the issues that we are being very, very conscious about. You know, despite saying no, government still go ahead because they think there might be a source of revenue much needed by Tonga. But we have been advocating that the money that might potentially come from any deep sea mining activity will never, not even close enough to balance out the environmental degradation that will happen in the deep, as well as a ramification to the livelihood of the people of Tonga. Phil?
Thank you, Malo Opito. Appreciate that. Next speaker is a colleague of mine, Duncan Curry. Duncan is an international lawyer. He engaged in the seabed mining proposals that went through the Environmental Protection Authority in New Zealand and through our courts. Duncan's been engaged at the International Seabed Authority in a consistent way for about a decade. And Duncan's the legal advisor for the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. Duncan, thank you for your time and welcome, and you have the floor.
Take myself off mute. Thank you, Phil, and Kia ora, everybody. Yes, Phil said, I'm Duncan Curry, the legal advisor to the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, and hopefully you can all see that screen now. I'm just going to go through the various international legal aspects by way of background and explanation and what we're asking for. Firstly, the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition is a coalition, it's actually now of over 100 organizations, focused on substantially reducing the greatest threats to life in the deep sea and safeguarding the long-term health, integrity, and resilience of deep sea ecosystems. And yeah, here's a list of a number of the organizations which are our members. And what is at stake here? You've heard somewhat about that, and you've saw the beautiful video. 90% of the marine environment is in the deep sea. By volume, over 90% of the planet can support animals. It's home to the greatest diversity of species and ecosystems on Earth. And the nodules, which are sought in this particular form of mining, which are polymetallic nodules, which look a little bit like a small potato, but that sort of size. Each of those nodules is a tiny ecosystem that has taken millions of years to form. I'm sure you're aware by now, the ocean has absorbed 25% of all carbons released by humans and over 90% of the heat, and is of enormous value in fisheries, livelihoods, pharmaceutical, and other reasons. And all of these are reasons is that under the International Law of the Sea Convention, or UNCLOS, is the common heritage of humankind. But it is vulnerable. And the Law of the Sea Convention was negotiated 40 years ago, back in the 1970s, when we were just beginning to learn about things like chemosynthetic life and hydrothermal vents. And since then, whole new issues have come on the horizon: climate change, biodiversity, the issue of planetary boundaries that we're all aware of. And so unfortunately, the entire system our concerns have now changed, and many of them aren't addressed in the Law of the Sea Convention. But just again, briefly, some of the impacts, for example, on biodiversity, is that papers have shown that biodiversity loss will be unavoidable, including, but not only, on the nodule species dependent on the nodules for survival. We literally don't know what is there. New species are being found all the time. And some of the primary issues are both the deep water sediment plume that will be released in deep sea, as well as the midwater sediment plume, which even MIT have said will travel over 1,400 kilometers and be suspended for well over a year. Dr. Devaraman, a well-known deep sea scientist, has made the observation that we cannot protect what we don't know.
Duncan, sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
Can you change it to presenter mode? It'll make the screen bigger and might be easier to see for people.
Sorry, have I gone out of that? Yes, okay, sorry about that. I thought I was there. Thank you, Barry, appreciate that. And if we continue, we could cause irreparable damage and lose parts of the planet before we even truly know them. And just worth noting a few of the comments or the acknowledgements really made by the metals companies when it was floated. The deep green, as it used to be then called, was combined with what's called a SPAC on Wall Street, and to do so, that to file a number of documents with the US Securities Exchange Commission. And there they acknowledged that there was uncertainty regarding the impacts of nodule collection on biodiversity, which could potentially be more significant than currently expected. They acknowledged that it's unknown how effectively mitigation strategies can prevent biodiversity loss and species extinctions. They acknowledge that impacts on biodiversity and the ecosystem cannot and may never be completely and definitively known. And they didn't say it's unknown whether the impact of nodule collection on global biodiversity will be less significant than those observed and measured with respect to land-based mining for a similar amount of required material. Now, these are really significant concessions made by the metals company, and 180 degrees different from what they have said in the previous years before they merged with to form the metals company, and they need to be held accountable for their own words. And a few words on deep sea mining and the metals that can be obtained. Just to observe that the need for a circular economy and a transformational economy to which we know that can reduce the demand for virgin metals. We know that new battery technologies are entering the market that do not need deep sea minerals. And the argument that it will replace terrestrial mining is simply a false narrative. It will not replace terrestrial mining. It will be in addition to terrestrial mining. And also, if you hear that it is needed for the renewables revolution, I'll get there in the end, then we have a number of documents on deep sea conservation website if you look for the fact sheets in which we address those. I don't really have time to go into them in great detail other than to say a number of companies have already signed up. They pledged not to use deep sea minerals in their supply chains. And moving to the Law of the Sea Convention, that one of the crucial provisions is that the area, which is the international area beyond the continental shelf, is a common heritage of mankind, the exploration and exploitation of which shall be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole. And one of the most crucial provisions is Article 145 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which requires the Seabed Authority to ensure effective protection for the marine environment from harmful effects of seabed mining activities. And there are other provisions, but really this is an absolutely core issue of ensuring effective protection. And I would say that it is actually well supported by the New Zealand Supreme Court decision recently in the TTR seabed mining case, when the Supreme Court quite separately also talked about avoiding harmful effects of seabed mining. Phil talked a little bit about the 2-year rule, a tiny bit of background on that. In 1994, the US and the United Kingdom were uncomfortable with a lot of the provisions in the existing agreement as negotiated. And so some benefit sharing provisions were taken out and a lot of power was given to developed as opposed to developing countries. But one crucial provision, which was triggered by Nauru in June 2021, said that if a request is made by a state, in this case it's made by Nauru on behalf of its subsidiary Nori, which is this contracting party Nori, which is a subsidiary of the metals company. And what on the face of it states that if the council has not completed elaboration of the rules and regulations for exploitation, it shall nonetheless consider and provisionally approve such plan of work. Now this has opened a whole Pandora's box. The Nauru claims and others claim this means that the council shall complete the adoption of regulations within 2 years, which is July 2023. A number of other states observe that the 2-year rule actually does also say, and if they haven't, then something else must be done. So there's a lot of legal questions around that. And the second part of it about the application for a plan of work is likely to come up in the second half of 2023 to the first half of 2024. And there's a discussion in the Seabed Authority in November over what that would mean. A few words about the ISA, and just as one of, I think, the important concerns about seabed mining are lack of information and the damage that we do know will be caused. There are also very real concerns about the Seabed Authority itself. It was set up, as I said, and negotiated in the 1970s. The contract was finalized, the convention was finalized in 1982. And yet the Legal and Technical Commission, which does a lot of the heavy lifting, and on the face of it, it's a body that makes recommendations. In reality, it is an extremely powerful body, meets behind closed doors, even though it was specifically asked by the Assembly, which was the supreme organ in 2017, to hold more open meetings. The LTC has basically just said, no, we don't want to do that. And the second big problem, and this is a real crucial issue, is that if regulations are adopted in July 2023 or thereafter, that will basically mean seabed mining starts. And the reason I emphasize this is that some countries, including New Zealand, have taken the stance that the answer to the 2-year rule and to the problems that we've highlighted is to put into place environmental or the best regulations that they can get together. The problem there is that there's a fundamental problem in that any recommendation for a mining contract or a plan of work can only be overturned effectively by the council by a 2/3 majority vote of the council, together with all of the so-called chambers. And I won't go into what that means in practical terms. It means it's virtually impossible. So this is what the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition has been really trying to emphasize to all the countries that we can talk to, is that if regulations are adopted in July 2023, quite frankly, no matter what those regulations say, the reality is that we have a body meeting behind closed doors with only 2 or 3 biologists on the 30-person body, the rest of whom are geologists and bureaucrats and lawyers, and that a recommendation, in our experience that these recommendations will be made, are almost impossible to overturn. Just finally, just to note, there's an inherent conflict of interest. The Seabed Authority is both the regulator as well as the beneficiary of what could effectively be billions of dollars in revenue from the licenses through royalties. There is absolutely a massive bureaucratic momentum to mine that we're fighting against all the time. And the last problem that we have is the regulations that are under consideration at the moment don't just address nodule mining, which is the current interest, but all forms of international seabed mining in the area. Yeah, I don't have time to go over the financial matters, but other than to note that the monies that are promised to the Pacific Island states are frankly not the riches that some of the politicians make out that they will be. We've noted, for example, Nauru has agreed with its contractor not to charge any corporate taxes at all. We know that from one of the documents they filed with the Securities Exchange Commission. We know, for example, that PNG lost $120 million in a failed venture with the Solwara 1 project. Another company that applied for a seabed mining applications in Mexico is suing Mexico for $3.5 billion for not getting the consent it required. So this is a big flashing light, I think, to countries that are considering offering exploration permits, let alone exploitation permits, is that they could well be setting themselves up for liability. And if and when seabed mining did start, that sponsoring states can be liable for the damages caused. And yeah, we've talked about this. What I do want to say is the G7 only last week issued a very lengthy statement on seabed mining, and what I've got a quotation here. They said the G7 is fully aware of the potentially devastating impacts on marine ecosystems and the functioning of the ocean as a climate regulator. Now that, and in order to safeguard the integrity, connectivity, and functioning of the deep sea ecosystems. Anyone who reads that will say, whoa, this is a really powerful statement from the G7. And again, just last week. They went on to say, we will continue to actively engage in the development of the regulations for exploitation under the ISA. Now that statement could be read as being a little bit ambiguous. If they mean to say they want to ensure or participate in the development of the regulations, then that is completely antithetical to the statement they've just made, because as I said, development of regulations will mean the start of seabed mining, and it will be almost impossible to stop. If by that they mean they'll actively engage in the development of regulations, but not necessarily adopt the regulations, then there may be some scope for movement there and towards a moratorium. And this, we're getting to the end of the presentation, that what the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition is calling for is a moratorium unless and until environmental, social, and economic risks are comprehensively understood. The mining can be managed to ensure effective protection of the marine environment and no loss of biodiversity, that there is free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples and communities, that all alternatives have been fully explored and applied, that there is broad and informed public support secured, and that mining fulfills the obligation to benefit humankind as a whole. And importantly, there is comprehensive reform of the International Seabed Authority for a transparent, accountable, inclusive, and environmentally responsible decision-making and regulatory process. And the IUCN last year passed the important Resolution 122, where they supported such a moratorium. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there, just other than to say that the issue of public participation, again, they're really big ongoing problems. I'm happy to discuss this in the discussion that will follow. And at the end of the presentation, there are some references that hope this will support some of the comments I've made on science. So thank you very much, and back to you, Phil.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you for that really good overview of where we're at now and what's going on at the ISA. I hope we can get into some meaty questions in answer time. Next speaker, I'd like to welcome Tiano Tuiono, who is a Green Party MP and also a member of the Pacific Parliamentarians Alliance on Deep Sea Mining, which is a collective of parliamentarians across, I think, 10 jurisdictions across the Pacific, calling for a moratorium collectively. Tiano's 20 years of experience as an activist, advocate and organizer at local, national and international levels. Tiano, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time, and you have the floor. Kia ora.
Kia ora, everyone, and I've been listening with interest to everything that's being said. It's raining at the moment, actually, so there's a lot of wind just sort of trickling down my window, so I do actually feel I'm at the bottom of the ocean. Thank you very much, Duncan, for that, quite frankly, alarming detail. As you were saying that stuff around the extractive industries, I really did feel like we were having Groundhog Day here. And it was one of the issues that came up when we launched the alliance. And I do want to thank all of the work that's been done out in the Pacific, Joey, Tita, and all of our other neighbours and relatives that are around the Pacific that are organising to push back against deep sea mining. It was that work which actually pulled us together, the Pacific Parliamentarians Alliance on Deep Sea Mining, which is a collective of Pacifica leaders across the Pacific who share strong concerns about large corporations and powerful governments planning to exploit the ocean floor for minerals. Our alliance is being chaired at the moment by the leader of the opposition in Vanuatu, Ralph Regenvanu, and includes MPs from Aotearoa, the autonomous region of Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, Guam, Fiji, Te Ao Maohi, French-occupied Polynesia, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Palau. Probably a whole lot of other places as well. I guess the way that I see this stuff personally is I look at it in terms of the context of the times that we're living in. We are in the middle of a climate crisis. We are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. A moratorium should be the first step that we go to, and not the last step. No one, especially corporations, should have the right to go and make a mess of the ocean floor, given the context of the times that we're living in. And so that's just my personal reflection. And I was thinking back to the launch, because we launched the alliance in April, to one of the comments by one of the members from Maohi Nui, French Polynesia, Moitai Brotherson, who talked about the history of extractive industries and how phosphate was mined out of the makatea. And so folks that don't know, phosphate was mined out of the Pacific, and they'd come to places like New Zealand, primarily New Zealand, with the phosphate, turn that phosphate into fertilizer, dump it on our farms, which would then, of course, lead to the intensive dairying farming and our main contribution to climate change. But that was extractive industries from the makatea, and it was a personal reflection for me because my grandfather was a 14-year-old who went to mine phosphate from the island of Achu in the Cook Islands. So we have this long history of people of using the Pacific of a place where we go and take things, whether it's phosphate, whether it's this new so-called bonanza at the bottom of the ocean floor. But on top of that, it is also seen as a place where we can get cheap labor. You just look at what happens in New Zealand around with the RSC workers. It's the history of New Zealand's exploitative role, from my perspective, with the Pacific. And just last year, we just had the apology for the Dawn raids, where New Zealand would bring in workers from the Pacific, and as soon as they weren't discarded, they would whip up anti-immigration sentiment to deport people back to the Pacific. So it is that relationship that is there. And it is something that is really, really important when we think about what's happening in the Pacific, particularly around deep sea mining in this case. Probably the other thing that was very alarming for me is because NORA was one of the places that got dug out completely by phosphate for fertilizers and whatnot. And so it is disappointing for me that that lesson hasn't been learned by them. It is disappointing for me that they were the country that actually triggered this over at the ISA as well, because this is something that happened in the past. These companies have, extractive industries have come into the Pacific before in the case of phosphate, and here they are coming in again with all of these promises. And I would like to get one of those, get that PowerPoint presentation off you, Duncan, where you highlighted where the promises of the company don't actually match what actually comes out at the end for the countries as well, and for us to actually to amplify that, so that when people get involved in this, that it's really important that is front of mind for them. In terms of actions going forward, I think we've got a lot of work in front of us, but I am encouraged by the connections that we can make. I am encouraged by the collaborations that we can have. And we see this here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I know it's within our territorial boundaries what has been happening out in Taranaki, and I know folks on this call have been involved with that, with our relatives over at Ngāti Uruanui and Rauru, Kitahi. I think Chasm's on here, Greenpeace, lots of other community groups as well, pushing to stop seabed mining here within Aotearoa, New Zealand. But it's important that we match that action at home with what we go overseas to advocate for as well, and to see those things as deeply connected, because they are. You know, the ocean doesn't care where the border, where there's no borders in the ocean. The ocean doesn't care about that, and neither should we. We should try to find all of those connections as much as possible. I was reflecting on what was happening there in terms of the judgment that came out around the ability for tikanga to be included in the consideration of in the way of giving out these applications and so on and so forth. I was thinking about that in the case of right around in the Pacific, because yes, governments are being involved, but how are Indigenous people's communities being involved? How are coastal communities being involved as well? Unlike here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where they try to settle the treaty and all of that kind of stuff. And for me, the treaty is an ongoing relationship. I'm talking about Te Tiriti o Waitangi here as well. There are in different places in our different Pacific Island communities where the traditional leadership is still quite strong, and there's some control. I think in the Cook Islands it's out to the 12 nautical mile mark, and it will be different in other places where those communities must be engaged. We have lots of different international instruments. I'm thinking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's stuff in the Convention of Biological Diversity, the various other international instruments as well, which say, hey, look, if you're going to do proper consultation, proper collaboration, you must do this. And has that been happening out in the Pacific? It doesn't look like that to me. And so that is an area I think we should really really step into. It's an area that we have built on in the past, and I'm reflecting on past movements like the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific. I'm thinking about the movements built around climate change, and I was encouraged when Tuvalu kind of stepped back from their support from deep sea mining as well. And I wanted to acknowledge the role that the Pacific Elders Voice had. We had leaders like the Honourable Anele Sopuanga talking about the deep connections that Pacific peoples have with the ocean, have with our climate, and have with our environment. We need to put that at the center of everything that we do. We've got to remember that's what it's all about. It's about this connection between us and the environment, and to look for different ways that we can actually build and support and connect with each other from all the different perspectives that we carry as well. And just before I finish, I guess one of the calls is that we should be supporting, that I will be pushing for, and I hope you will as well, is to support the call for the Pacific Blue Line, to support Indigenous and environmental leadership around the Pacific, and also specifically to call for that transparency, which is glaringly missing at the ISA as well, so that when they say and do these things, we can see them doing it, and we can call them out. We can call them out about what they're doing, because We are in the middle of a climate crisis. We are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. No one should have the right to be disrupting the environment, particularly at this particular time, using untested science. It does not make any sense. So on that, I will end, and I will once again thank you to the organisers for pulling us together, and also thank you to all our Pacific neighbours and relatives, and also all our scientists and environmental NGOs that are doing what they can, doing what you can to do the work that needs to be done. Mai taki I rānui nui. Kia ora.
Kia ora, te anō. Thank you for that kōrero. Really, really inspiring and appropriate as we, as this campaign or this issue unfolds. I just want to quickly respond to a couple of things you said there. It's true that in New Zealand and in the cases here, with particularly the South Taranaki case with TTR, the opposition was broad spectrum and in large numbers, and people from all sectors of society actively opposed TTR's plans. And that's what we're seeing unfold in the international context. People and groups from industry, etc., are coming together and making the same calls. Moving to question and answer section of this webinar, I would like to just start, if I could, pose something to the panelists for some response. In March 2022, just a couple of months ago, a collective of former heads of state and high-level leaders across the Pacific region, known as the Pacific Elders' Voice, released a call for a halt to seabed mining. Their concerns included environmental, social and cultural impacts, the lack of scientific and technical information, and a lack of regulatory capacity on processes for deep sea mining. And I'd also like to quote it from them: "It is a fact that most of the Pacific Island countries contemplating seabed mining do not have the capacity to effectively monitor such mining operations in which they may be involved." Tita, you kind of touched on that. Would you like to elaborate a little bit, or anyone else? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Phil. I'll take the first step at responding to the statement. Phil, I totally agree 100% with this call. And it is echoed by civil society position in Tonga. We're calling for this ban. And we don't have the capacity. We don't have the capability. We don't have the resources. We don't have the fund and the expertise. I think one perfect example, Phil, was the EIA from NORI in the statement that came out. I remember how much time we did ask to have a thorough examination of that, and how much knowledge that need to go into dissecting and ensuring that that EIA was properly done, and it was for the sake of the environment and the people, and not pro-supporting the contractors' objectives. So yes, I would fully support this, and I joined this call by the elders, not only from a cultural perspective, but this is a proven fact. We don't have the resources. Malo.
Malo, Tita. Joey, any input from you there?
Yeah, I totally support the statements from, that have been coming out from the Pacific Elders' Voices, but would also just like to challenge our regional premier, policy institute, the Pacific Island Forum. And I can see a question in the Q&A by Colin Phillip that raises about the Pacific Leaders Forum. I think New Zealand has a moral responsibility to the region in terms of, pushing a moral, high ethical position within the forum space, but also at the ISA. We can draw back from experiences, as Teano was saying. The days of nuclear-free, independent Pacific informed a nuclear-free zone. The impacts of climate change, that our Pacific people are at the forefront, is informing this collective regionalism response to, calling for better climate response from, the development partners. And I think our Pacific leaders can inform a position, a regional position to protect our ocean with regards to deep sea mining. If we can do it for a nuclear-free zone, I'm sure we could do it for a region that is free from deep sea mining exploitation. But the challenge is on New Zealand, if it could play its regional leadership.
Yes, New Zealand. New Zealand. We've been calling on New Zealand to take a leading role on this, given our position and our relationships across the region, but more so, or equally so, our experience with this particular activity. The cases that have gone through our courts have shown that the activity can't be done without causing serious harm, and that there's broad spectrum opposition. James, just inviting James Hita back on deck to potentially pose questions in the chat, and please, I invite further questions to go into the Q&A. Thank you, James.
Kia ora koutou. So there was the one from Colleen about the Pacific Island Leaders Forum, and I just wanted to check that no one else wanted to give additional comment on that. Cool. So the next one was from Lyndon, and they say, many thanks to all speakers for the excellent background and detail. My question is in respect of what interaction/regulatory roles can the developing BB&J treaty have with the International Seabed Authority? For example, how would future establishment of marine protected areas under the BB&J affect ISA permits and vice versa? Duncan?
Yep, happy to take that on. Really good question, Lyndon. Firstly, I'd say obviously the BB&J treaty is still under negotiation, so nothing's final yet. But I would say, for example, the provisions on environmental impact assessment could be very valuable, because already the environmental impact assessments have been shown to be really deficient in terms of procedure, public consultation, and so on. And so the BB&J treaty will set the bar for environmental impact assessments in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which does include the deep seabed area. The precise way that will still be implemented is under intense negotiation. Article 23, which is the article of the treaty which talks about that, is frankly very confused, and there's a lot of options in it. So it's hard to be definitive, but that certainly is one area where it will be relevant. You also asked about marine protected areas and the so-called areas of particular environmental interest, or APEIs. And I'd say the same thing. I mean, the underlying principle in the BB&J is that the decisions taken shall not undermine other organizations. However, the High Seas Alliance and others argue that is also a two-way street, and that, for example, the ISA should also not take actions which undermine the actions or the biodiversity considerations under BB&J. So again, the precise parameters of that are still under discussion. The new president's text has only been released a couple of days ago, which has new provisions on MPAs and area-based management tools. So I think I would say on that, watch the space. But I would just want to close with a real issue of concern. In my presentation, I talked about the midwater plume, and just as a little bit of background there, the current proposal is that the sediment, and we're talking a lot about huge amounts of sediment, will be sucked up on big, what are called risers up to the surface vessel. They would then be processed to take out the nodules which they want. And the sediment they don't want would then be discharged only into about 1,200 meters of water. So, and remember, this is 3,000 or 4,000 meters deep. So effectively into the mid-ocean. We know absolutely nothing about that area of ocean they plan to discharge into, which is into what's called the bathypelagic area, or into the deep sea. We know very little about the composition of the plume, how long it will last, and so on. So this to me is a really crucial issue, because how that will interface with the BB&J, we don't know yet. I mean, because project ourselves forward, if deep sea mining were to start in the next few years, and then a year or two later, we found there were really significant impacts on tuna populations, and there are some papers to say this is a possibility, then what would be the ability of BBNJ to say to the International Seabed Authority, sorry, this is really causing major damage to biodiversity, you need to stop? The answer is extremely unclear, and that's one of the reasons that we say these regulations must not be developed while these questions are still out there and are unresolved. Thanks.
Tēnā koe, Duncan. Thank you for your answer on that. I quickly will just share a comment rather than a question from Scott McIndoe. Thank you on behalf of the many people who make up the New Zealand Sport Fishing Council, its public outreach legacy, the New Zealand Underwater Association, New Zealand Angling and Casting Association, Yachting New Zealand. He also says, I can assure you that these representative organisations are opposed to the nonsense of seabed mining, and I like that, and will be standing alongside you warriors when it counts to oppose this violation of our sacred benthic environment. Kia kaha. Thank you, Scott, for that. Now, there are two questions that are very similar, and they're about China. One from the Honourable Eugenie Sage and also from Paul Brodie. Eugenie says, many thanks for the excellent presentations. Does anyone know to what extent China is raising seabed mining in its interactions with Pacific states? And the other was very similar. Does anyone want to take that? Duncan?
Yeah, I would only say, Jane, it's a very good question. We know that the what's so-called Common Development Vision, which was leaked, includes statements saying that China wants to engage the Pacific Island states in, I think their words are, through jointly formulating a marine spatial plan to optimize the layout of the marine economy and to develop and utilize marine resources rationally so as to promote a sustainable development of blue economy. Now that, to my mind, is bureaucratic speak, if I can put it that way, which could well include seabed mining. We don't know for a fact, of course, what discussions were had by the Chinese government with Pacific Island countries, but this kind of wording is concerning. Having said that, I would say that China has consistently taken a stance in the International Seabed Authority where they're not in a rush. They're not one of the countries who are agitating to go seabed mining now. And while they certainly are increasing their seabed, deep seabed and deep sea capabilities, and they've got some very significant operations in China, again, they're not one of the countries which are out there agitating for urgent big commencement of seabed mining. So that's the only other comment I make on that. Thanks.
Maybe just to add on to Duncan, just as we are very vigilant about China, there are other geopolitical powers who have a greater interest in this part of the world, or you have France through its territories in the Pacific. So just as we are watching out China, we should also be watching out other strategic partners who continue to support or facilitate this project.
Thank you, Joey.
And if I could just jump in there and support what Joey is saying as well. Like, I mean, like in my comments earlier, I was highlighting the very problematic nature that New Zealand has with the Pacific as well. Should we be concerned about other powers in the Pacific? Well, we should be, but we should just be seeing that through the lens of all of that, and should be organising ourselves accordingly. So it was interesting for me to hear Duncan's reflections on how China is playing this in terms of deep sea mining as well, and what that might mean with how we might collectively organise ourselves as well. Thanks.
Tēnā koe tui ono. Te anō, never gotten your name wrong like that. It's the lack of sleep. Last question here I've got from, another one has just come through as well. Simon Terry. To what extent is any mining activity being faced with liability for carbon emissions it triggers? If such liability is not included as a condition of mining, then there could be no confidence that miners would even attempt to avoid disruptive methane hydrate beds. Who wants to take that question for us? Duncan, thank you.
If others don't want to, I'm happy to come in. First, thanks, Simon, and kia ora for that. The first comment I'd make is that methane hydrates themselves tend to be on continental shelves, so I'd put that in one particular category. There absolutely are major liability issues, and that's a real concern. This whole issue goes right back to 2011 when Nauru was investigating seabed mining and initiated a request to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea on what the parameters will be for liability. And Greenpeace and WWF both argued, I was their counsel, argued that there should be residual liability by the state. The Tribunal for the Law of the Sea answered, actually, no, there's not. But they did lay down some very specific requirements, not only for that due diligence be observed by the sponsoring state, but also they have specific requirements, such as to implement the precautionary approach, to undertake environmental assessments and so on. And they also specifically said that they don't get if I paraphrase, a get out of jail free card by being a developing state. In other words, they still have to implement the same due diligence requirements. And Tita, I think really importantly, hit the nail on the head when she said, well, Tonga doesn't have the ability to implement these requirements. And think of Nauru with a country of 10,000 people. It is a real concern, and twinned with that concern is the concern that, frankly, we know damage will be caused. And what we have seen in the Pacific is that these multinationals, predominantly what was Deep Green is now the Metals Company, established subsidiaries in these Pacific states, Tonga, Kiribati, and Nauru, and similarly with GSR in the Cook Islands. These subsidiaries are thinly capitalized, and quite frankly, there's nothing stopping them, these companies, from just walking away, locking the door and walking away, saying, see you later on. There's no way to hold their parent's company liable. So what that means in practical terms would that be that, yes, either the sponsoring state such as Nauru is left holding that liability, or the liability is simply not addressed. And both of these, or neither of these, are good outcomes.
Thank you, Duncan. And just as a follow-up to that, there's a question from Kath Wallace from ECO. Could the ISA itself face such liability?
And the short answer is yes. And there are some specific requirements. I talked about Article 145 and the requirement to ensure effective protection of the marine environment. If they don't do so, they could be liable as well in a different way. But I think the ones who really need to be held to account are both the sponsoring states and indeed the contractors. This is a line of work the DSCC has been promoting, and we actually made some headway in the Seabed Authority just as recently as last March in raising this issue of what's called effective control and sounding the alarm that these companies are not under the effective control of the companies, and that is a real structural problem. So thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. Just a comment more so than a question, but I'll frame it. I won't read the whole thing from Barbara Hammonds, but it speaks to the impacts of the plume, and that being one of the major concerns, and the release of sediment and nutrients into the water column, which would have widespread unknown impacts on marine life. And really it finishes with, it's time for a paradigm shift. Humans are part of nature, not separate, and able to exploit it at will. And I think this, and I'd like to sort of swing the conversation a little bit back to this being a moral issue that requires a measure of courage and boldness, but just countries, states, leaders, decision makers at every level to step up and do the right thing. And so anyone want to pick that up any further around what we need to see? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important for us to be very vocal and to be heard. In my short time as an elected representative, it's easy to be distracted by the noise, right? So and we know that corporations and companies they're noisier than others. They're noisier than most. So what we need to be doing is empowering folks on the ground. And so there was, I can't remember which slide it was who said it, but it was around FPIC, around free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, communities, coastal communities as well. Where are those voices? Where are those voices that actually have that long historical link about what you were just saying before, Phil, about the connection between that knowledge that people are actually part of the environment, that ecological wisdom. You know, let's pair that together with the science, with the wisdom, and to sort of acknowledge those connections and to raise up and amplify those voices as much as possible, because the other side are well funded, they're incredibly loud, and we've got to do what we've always done, and that is to reach out and connect across all our different movements, all our different communities, all our different NGOs, and all that, to sort of make those connections and to make ourselves be heard as well over the ruckus of the corporations.
Thank you, Gianna. And what is it that we're asking of our leaders, our decision makers?
What I heard was what landed with me was something that Joey said about making sure that New Zealand plays a more prominent role in the Pacific Leadership Forum. That landed for me, and so I will put that on my agenda to make sure that we push to do that. Could it be embarrassing for them because they haven't moved fast enough on seabed mining here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Probably. But the way that they can deal with that is by sorting out the issue for the whānau out there and for everybody that's been doing all that good work out in Taranaki as well at the same time. So making sure that can happen as well. I don't know if leaders have really kind of gotten in on the Indigenous to Indigenous space as well, knowing that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, she's from the Kingitanga, and Naya Mahuta is part of the Kingitanga as well, and so that relationship between actual councils of chiefs and people that are actually out there outside of the Westminster system, which is the dominant system apart from French Polynesia, which actually governs our Pacific Island nations as well, and making sure that those connections are there so that they are fully informed. Because the anecdotal evidence that I'm hearing is the companies show up, and they all the people that show up, and then they hear it, and then they think that's it. And so making sure that voice is there and connected is really important. And then, of course, during that, making those connections between all the good folks here as well with the work that's been done in the Pacific. Cheers.
Kia ora. Go ahead, James.
I was just passing on through to Duncan. Did he want to follow on from that?
Thanks, James. Only to follow on to say that one specific thing New Zealand should, and we believe must do, is to embrace a moratorium. New Zealand needs to take leadership in the Pacific. We've heard from Tita about Tonga, which is a sponsoring state, but there's real concern from civil societies and others in Tonga. New Zealand, I think, needs to take a values-based approach to its foreign policy, be responsive to the concerns that they're hearing in the Pacific, and publicly embrace a moratorium that doesn't stop New Zealand from engaging in the ISA as they currently are, but it does mean that New Zealand would express some solidarity with other Pacific countries, as well as other countries that around the world that we know are showing some real concerns with this current direction that the ISA is going. And again, this is urgent. If these regulations were adopted in July of next year, then they will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to unpick. So New Zealand does need to embrace a moratorium sooner rather than later. Thanks.
Kia ora, Duncan. Thank you for that. And I think we have space for one more question. It's just a short one, and it's a good one because it does touch on the interconnectivity of the issues across the ocean. And Margaret asks, does this movement liaise with efforts to stop the ubiquitous rain of microplastics from killing seabed life anyway? Without choking, I do want to just quickly answer that question. So I work here in the Greenpeace Aotearoa office in Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland, and we also have a plastics campaign here that is actively working on changing the way we view plastics and we use plastics in our society, especially in Aotearoa. And they put out a lot of messaging around the way we should use plastics and getting rid of it from our system. So there are people like Jeressa Lee who do work in that space, and we work quite closely together. A lot of the people working in conservation and environmental issues like this have quite strong networks together. So absolutely, we recognise and understand that these issues are connected and do affect each other as well. So thank you for that question. Just checking before we close up, anyone else want to jump in?
Could I just follow up from you there, James? I mean, this kind of points a little bit to the converging issues. This is the ocean in general and the environment in general is, we all know it's tracking downwards. It's headed in the wrong direction. And the enabling of a new activity that guarantees further destruction and degradation is downright irresponsible. And it crosses over, this would potentially exacerbate all of the other issues that we're currently facing already from our past actions. So with that, thank you. Any other comments before we move to close? Any final comments from speakers?
Maybe just to add, and my last comments is we need to really call out deep sea mining an industry or an experiment that is heavily speculative in nature. It's one that is a fundraiser and one that we really need to call out as it is. Secondly, there is this notion to review or reform the ISA, and it's a challenge and appeal to our Pacific leaders. If there is a motion before the ISA Council or Assembly, it's our challenge to lobby our governments to support that challenge. We need to reform or review the very mechanism or institution that has been mandated to administer the law of our sea.
Thank you, Joey. And I think that's a really good point around the reform of the ISA. I think what I'm at least observing across all of the various sort of groups that are speaking out on this issue, there seems to be three pillars to the call for a pause. And they are, the lack of scientific knowledge to be able to, really know how this is going to play out, the inescapable severe environmental impacts of the activity, and thirdly is the need for reform of the ISA because they are not fit for purpose. They were set up, 30, 50 years ago, and it needs to be brought into the 21st century. And on the reform of the ISA, that to me is one action that leaders, we can't do too much about the destruction of the activity or in the short term fix our lack of scientific knowledge. That's a longer term action. But the current action, the one thing that states could lead on is reform of the ISA. And we feel that while that reform, the reform should be urgently set in motion, and while that reform is in process, there should be no issuing of new exploration licenses. There should be no issuing of exploitation mining licenses, which trigger the activity from starting. And there should be, the rules and regulations should not yet be adopted. Thank you, Joey, and thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the participants. I'd like to hand over to James Heater, who I would like to effectively close with a statement. Thanks, James. Thank you all again.
Kia ora, Phil. So one of the beautiful things about our culture here is that we like to open our spaces and close them so that we leave these spaces feeling refreshed and informed and motivated to take action as well. So in a moment, I'll close us off, but I do encourage you to stick around to hear just one more word from Barry from ECO. But I will say that we've just launched a petition at Greenpeace Aotearoa calling on the New Zealand government, specifically our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nanaia Mahuta, and we're calling on her to take a strong stand against deep sea mining in the Pacific and announce New Zealand's support for a global moratorium. So I've got that link just here for you. So if you do get a moment, please sign it, please share it with your friends and whānau, your family, and get them to do that. But I'll just round us out now. Kia whakaira te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia taruki whakataha ai, kia taruki whakataha ai. Haumie, huie, taikie. And the translation for that is restrictions are moved aside so the pathways are clear to return to our everyday activities. Ngā mihi nui.
Thanks, James, and thanks to the speakers, and thanks everyone. Just as a final comment, James has introduced what we can do in the future, which is Greenpeace has launched a petition, as well as the closing for the petition in New Zealand for a ban on mining in New Zealand, and launching the petition for a moratorium on mining and getting New Zealand to support a moratorium on mining in the high seas. And you can also do, these things are not financially free, they cost funds. So if you want to help ECO support this webinar and support future webinars, we're quite keen to do and promote this issue in the future. And it's like the campaign that stopped mining in Antarctica. It's the same issues that happened in the 80s into the early 90s. We managed to get a ban on mining in Antarctica. We can do it. We can get this moratorium on the high seas. So thanks everyone, and sign the petitions. He kona mai, mina mihi nui ki a koutou, kia pai te rā. Thanks everyone.
Kia ora, thank you everybody.